All right, welcome. Welcome. Woohoo! Here we are. Good to have you. Thank you. So this is the Extracurricular. It is the community track here at TDX. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Chuck Liddell. I am the CEO of an ISV. We have an integration app on the App Exchange. I'm also a Salesforce certified instructor, an MVP, a user group leader, and I have 22 certifications. And I'm your host today. I'm one of the organizers, and I'm very happy to introduce you to this community session. The Extracurricular is a little different than what you're used to. This is, we're calling it a peer-to-peer learning forum. This is an opportunity to have a conversation as a group about something technically difficult, right? This is a deep dive. This is not really fluffy. There's not a lot of slides here. This is about going deep on a highly technical subject with a group of people that are very experienced. And we're going to sort of tease out the nuance of this difficult stuff. And the reason that we're doing this is because at a certain point, as you learn, it becomes harder and harder to learn by yourself just reading documentation. You really have to have a conversation with somebody that's done it before. So how do we create opportunities for people to have these types of conversations? If you don't know the right people, how do you get that conversation to happen? So this is an experiment of sorts. It's the first time we've ever done something like this. And it is intentionally, we're trying to create a moment that I hope will become organic for you, where we can have this conversation with the panel and the moderator and the speaker, and then also the audience as well. So a lot of back and forth. This is a very long period of time. We have a 2-hour block. I'll explain the structure here in a second. But this is we wanted to take a real chunk of time to go deep. So if you need to get up and go to another session, that's fine. If you come in late, that's fine. This is very transient. But we're going to take some real time here. We're going to dig in. And a heavy portion of that is Q&A, right? This is very light on the presentation, very heavy on the discussion. So be prepared for that. Put on your thinking hats. Let me walk you through the structure. So we have some warm-ups here. We have a couple quick talk speakers that are going to come up and just do a 5-minute talk on something they think is cool or they built that they're proud of. No Q&A, just sort of, hey, here's a cool thing that I did. We'll have 2 of those. And then I'll introduce the main panel. We'll have a main speaker and a moderator. The moderator is here to sort of facilitate discussion. And then I have a 3-person panel. And the panel's job is to be your proxy. Their job is to ask questions that they think you would like to hear the answers to. And then we'll let you ask your own questions as well. So a lot of Q&A, a lot of discussion. Okay? That's the format. I'm very happy to have you here. I'm very excited about how this goes. Please give us feedback. We are experimenting with this, so a lot of room for improvement. But without further ado, allow me to introduce my first speaker, Sandesh Dungari. Come on up, Sandesh.
Hi. A very good morning, everyone. Today I would like to talk about natural language processing and how we can use Einstein language APIs such as Sentiment API and Intent API to achieve this. So what is a sentiment analysis or an intent analysis? Sentiment analysis is analyzing the text and getting the user's sentiment or feeling about our product or our brand kind of thing. And what about the Intent API? Intent API is also similar, like it's text analysis to understand the user's underlying intent. So let's see a quick demo on how we do it. So if you see here in my sample record, we have this is an opportunity for the ultimate buffet, and if you see here, we have as text notes called as sales notes. So what Einstein Sentiment API does here is it analyzes this text and returns a response saying whether it is a positive sentiment or a negative sentiment or a neutral sentiment. Let's see how it does it. Let me open my IntelliJ IDE and let me run the batch jobs here. Let me run the batch job. This is the batch job for sentiment analysis, and this is the batch job for intent analysis. Let me run both the jobs just to save some time here. Okay, sorry. Okay, so it's successful. The batch job is successful. So let's see here. If you see here, right, let me refresh the page to see what sentiment API has returned. So if you see here, right, the field called as Einstein sentiment, it says it gives a response of positive. So it means that the user's sentiment based on this text is positive. And if you see the sentiment rating, it is nothing but a probability. The probability of this text being positive is like 61%. Let me quickly take you through the debug logs so that you can see the response and the structure of the request. So if you see this debug log, right? So what we are doing here is like basically making a authentication call for this to get this JSON web token, and we are using that web token to make a call to the actual Einstein sentiment API. If you see the endpoint here, and so the response returned contains a list of probabilities, saying like it's a positive probability or neutral probability and so on. So we can see it here. So the probability of this text being positive is 61%, whereas neutral is 35 and negative is 2%. So overall, this text seems like a positive sentiment. So we are displaying that positive sentiment over this here. So now we can say like, what is the use of this sentiment API? So sentiment API can be used, like not only as like for meeting or case notes, or even for even to process the emails from the customers or prospects, and also it can be used in like on the social media as well, so that we can analyze the sentiment, the common sentiment of the users for our brand kind of thing. So it will help us to understand more about our customers, and it also will help us like to know like the trend of a lead or an opportunity, whether it will be able to close it or not. And we are analyzing this complete text and just giving it information into two fields which can be reported on. So it's basically a quantifiable result kind of thing. So let me quickly move on to the next one, the intent API. So if you see the intent API here, if you see, right, what is an intent API? As I said, it's an analysis of the text to understand the underlying intent of the user or the customer or a prospect. It could be anything, right? So because I have already run the batch job, let me refresh the page. So if you see here, right, if you see this case notes, it talks about like a specific product, saying guest center product bill, and it tells about like need a clarification regarding bill due notice. So based on the analysis of this text, Einstein has decided that the intent is billing, and also the probability, right? If you see the probability, it is like 78% of probability that this text is talking about billing. So let me quickly show you. I mean, like we can what we can do is like we can train our own AI, and let me show you a sample data set as how we can do that. If you see this data set, right, so I have almost like 150 records wherein we have different scenarios and like what it is related to. So it's basically we are training the Einstein such a way that it understands the text and correlates that to this. One last thing is like, let me show you like the commands which I used for creating this data set, right? So these are the commands for, this is the command for creating data set, and then you can also do check the status of the create, and also you need to execute one more command for training the data set, and also the last one is like checking the training status. So I would like to conclude here by saying that we can use both Einstein's sentiment and intent APIs to get a better feel of our customer or a prospect, and which will help us to increase our sales and also proactively provide service to the customer, kind of thing. And we can use this, like as I said, to chat or emails, or even like to have a monitoring on our social media. Thank you, guys. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sandesh. So our next Quick Talk speaker is Adam Rutland. Come on down. Has anyone actually worked with the Einstein Analytics API for sentiment or intent? Any play around with that yet?
Hi, my name is Adam Rutland. I work for a company called Velocity, and I am going to show how to dynamically upsert a list of S-object records in Apex. So it starts out with just the method signature here. Upserting records is going to be the easiest way to do an insert or update based on a unique field on the object. So here, our method signature, we want to return the database.upsert result with a passed in S-object type and a list of map string object that comes in. We're going to instantiate a new list of S-objects and then convert them to S-objects through this little helper method. This method is going to use the global describe to instantiate a new S-object here and add it, and then iterate over the map and add the fields to the S-object. So this method's pretty simple. It's ignoring a lot of things in Salesforce, like checking field level security, and I don't have time to go into all of the different exceptions you might run into doing it this way. But this is going to return a strongly typed account, and then we're going to add that to the upsert list and upsert using the all or none flag of false. And I wish it was that easy, but this is actually going to throw a runtime exception. The system type exception, DML on generic list of S objects, is only allowed for insert, update, or delete. So anyone who has done this before might know the little trick, but in this case, what you need to do is use type.forName, which allows passing in a string to instantiate a new type. So this is going to give you a strongly typed list in this case of accounts. And again, you iterate over the upsert list and insert them. So all or none is very important here because we don't want every single record to fail when only one is failing. So we'll get the upsert result. It's going to tell us whether it was created down here or if it was inserted new record. So now we're going to get a little greedy, and we're going to say one of the powers of upsert is that you can use it with any unique field that's an external ID. So in this case, we're going to upsert based on an external ID field for the list. So we pass in the S object type, we pass in the external ID field, and again, the code's going to look really similar, but in this case, we need to use the global describe again to get the field schema field value and pass that into the upsert list. So this code here works, but it's missing a really key component, and that is the ability to add the all or none flag. So if all we do is just add this all or none flag, then we're actually going to hit a compilation error. So unfortunately, This seems like a little bit of a blocker. Salesforce probably is not going to change this anytime soon, and we need to get this done right now. The error that you see is upsert with a field specification requires a concrete S object type. And so we're kind of just going to have to write it ourselves. So in order to dynamically upsert a list in Salesforce, one of the easiest ways possible, because there's definitely iterations you can do on this, you pass in the external ID field. I'm actually going to instantiate this time a map of string object, in this case the strongly typed object, and the string here key is going to be the actual value of the external ID field here from the map. So it's going to iterate over the list, add each record to the upsert map as an S object. Then it's going to do a dynamic SOQL query where we select the external ID field from, in this case, account, where the external ID field is in, and we're going to use the binding variable external IDs on the upsert map key set. Then we're going to run the dynamic SOQL query inside of a for loop, iterate over the found results and apply the ID to each value, and then upsert the list values using the all or none flag. So this requires one extra query, but it solves the issue of upserting very dynamically based on a passed-in list of map. And the roadmap here could be to add either dynamically getting the external ID from the global describe or allowing a more dynamic passing in, say, a list of fields and allowing a kind of matching key to be built based off of several fields. But that then makes this query much more complicated. So that's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Adam. So those two speakers that you just heard were Adam and Sandesh. Here are their names and email addresses. Take a quick photo of this if you want to follow up and ask some questions about what you saw, or just send them smiley faces for doing such a great job. Give you a second for that. Okay, I'd like to bring on our main group here and get started. Let me find my cheat sheet. All right. First, I'd like to bring up our main speaker, Carl. Carl Brundage is a Salesforce MVP and certified technical architect who has been working with the Salesforce platform since 2009. He was an early adopter of Salesforce Einstein Analytics, formerly Wave, and has published Einstein Analytics App Exchange apps that visualize financial results and operational metrics. Carl holds 25 Salesforce certifications and co-leads the Lehigh Valley Salesforce Developer Group. All right. Next up, I have Daniel Peter. He's going to be our moderator today. Daniel started his Salesforce career in 2009. He has worked in various roles, including ISVs and customers. He enjoys being part of the amazing Salesforce community, solving hard problems, and building cool stuff. He has spoken at various community conferences around the world and multiple times at Dreamforce. Some interesting facts about him are that he's been coding since 4th grade and got an MBA while living in a van. He lived in a van? All right, Daniel Peter. All right, our first panelist, Moyez Thanawala, lives in Dallas, Texas with his beautiful wife, Pam, his brilliant and beautiful daughter, Sarah, and his geriatric dog, Shasta. He is the principal and senior technical architect at Thanawala Digital. Moyez has been a Dreamforce speaker and has done an innumerable number of technical presentations to the Dallas Salesforce Developer User Group, which he founded and continues to organize. In his spare time, he likes watching Formula One and sailing. All right, panelist number 2, Don Robbins. Don Robbins is a well-known Salesforce MVP, instructor, author, and speaker, a custom business application developer for more decades than he cares to admit. He focuses on Salesforce technical instruction and knowledge sharing. Certified as a Platform 2 developer and an award-winning Salesforce instructor. Yep, come on up here, guys. Take your seats. An award-winning Salesforce instructor. He's presented and taught at annual Dreamforce conferences since 2010. He delivers Salesforce developer classes and workshops around the US and abroad, manages a team of instructors as a Salesforce training partner, and is the producer of the Pluralsight Salesforce play-by-play series. All right. Last but not least, Zachary Thomas. Zach currently serves as a strategy and growth analyst on Salesforce's product data science team, helping build tools that communicate data insights to product managers and executives across Salesforce. Previously, Zachary was Trailhead's first data scientist, helping set up the analytics infrastructure for the fun way to learn Salesforce. In his free time, Zachary loves to run, eat burritos, and explore San Francisco. Heartfelt. All right, so I will leave you in the hands of this incredibly well-credentialed group of people. Enjoy.
Thanks, Chuck. Now, as an architect, I spent a lot of time working with my customers on analytics and data integration questions. One of the things that's often overlooked when we're architecting, besides just the technical solution, is the element of cost. So I'm going to touch on that in the solution that I look at today. But the best way to understand that is to tell you a story. I'm going to tell you about one of my customers. I want you to meet Dan. Dan is the VP of Asset Management at a private real estate company. This company is based in New York City. They have a portfolio of multifamily apartment buildings all over Manhattan. So what does that mean? Well, they go out, they purchase buildings with some of their own money and money that they've raised from investors, and then they manage them. So Dan's responsible for things like the financial performance. Is the rent coming in greater than the expenses for cleaning or maintenance? He's also responsible for considering when is it time to refinance a particular property. Are rates going down? Are rates going up? Do we need to put more money into the building? He also makes those decisions about when is it time to sell a property. Is it time to divest ourselves of this and make some money on it? In addition to that, he's responsible for leasing performance. So from one tenant to the next, one person in an apartment building to the next, are rents going up? Are they going down? Are you giving concessions or discounts? So as you can imagine, with all this information, Dan's in various systems. He's in the property management and leasing system. He's in an accounting system called Yardi that summarizes millions of transactions for him. All these systems have different sources of information. Sometimes he'll get an Excel file. Sometimes he'll get CSV. He might get a PDF. Guess what? He even gets printed reports that he has to copy and paste information of to use in his analytics. Dan has a role really across his organization. There's a lot of different stakeholders that want input from him. The leasing team wants to know what should our promotions be. The construction team wants to know, do we need to renovate this apartment so that we can get a higher rent next time? Those investors, they want to know how their investments are doing. Are they have a positive return? Are the buildings doing well? And as you can imagine, the executive team and CEO, they want to know what's going on in the business right now. Well, what does Dan do? He's got all this information. He falls back on his training, and he dumps it all in Excel. Copy and paste, transpose. VLOOKUP, it's his best friend, because he's doing it all the time to try and make sense of this and give somebody an answer. Well, guess what? As soon as he gets that answer, the data's out of date. New month is rolled over. There's new transactions. Somebody wants it a different way. Dan is drowning, and he needs help. So what we're going to do, we're going to throw him a life preserver. We're going to help him out with a solution that can solve his challenges. And what are those challenges? There's three things. First, automated data management. How do we move him out of the data collection business and back into being an analyst? Well, I'm going to have a custom solution that involves AWS and SQL Server. Next, how do we analyze tens of millions of rows of data? It's not really something that's going to work well in a Salesforce report. Well, that's a place that Einstein Analytics comes into play. And then last but not least, we talked about different stakeholders, different ways of wanting to see data. We need to give Dan an easy way to customize these so he's not rebuilding everything from scratch every time a request comes in. For that, I'm going to use the Salesforce platform. Now, I know I talked a lot about different things that Dan did, but for my talk today, I really want to focus on these three things. Getting data into AWS, moving it into Salesforce, both the platform and the analytics, and then putting it all together. Cost, I mentioned that. We can't forget that. What Dan does is painful, but you know what? It's good enough. So the company is willing to make an investment in changing, but they have to have an ROI on this project. They can't be just an unlimited budget in order to deliver results. So let's look at the one piece that I talked about, the financials. I pulled out a general ledger, an income statement report here, just to show you the different components. If you look at all these detailed code names, 100-10 rent, these are categories for every financial transaction that goes in the organization. Every time a tenant pays rent, that goes into the rent category. Every time you put a coin in the laundry machine, that goes in the laundry income. Late fees, everything gets categorized this way, and it's a way that Dan can look at the data. I mentioned millions and millions of rows of data. Well, that's where the transactions come into play. Every tenant in every building creates their own transaction. If they pay with 2 checks, now you have 2 transactions. So Dan needs to see all that in an aggregated way. And last but not least, the customized display. So on the right, I had codes and names, very detailed. That's great for Dan. But when he's working with his executives, he wants to provide a more summarized view of just the rental revenue or just the utilities income. And then finally, if he's going out to his investors, he's just going to tell them what the income and the expenses and then the net profit was. So different ways that he can customize how this displays and maintain common definitions across the organization. So for that, the accounting system in my scenario is called Yardi. It's a fairly common system inside of real estate. It's a system that Dan uses. We're going to look, number 1, at data acquisition. So how do I get that data from Yardi to start with? Next, we're going to look at the financials dashboard, a way that he can have a common starting point for common questions that people ask, but still the ability to jump off and do ad hoc analysis. We're going to look at customizations of the general ledger. That's what I showed in the previous screen, those GL categories. That's going into my reporting classification object. So we'll look at how we load that. We'll look at how we load analytics, and then how we put the data flow together and give you that final solution. So that's my setup. Any questions from the panel before I dive into details?
Yeah, I got one, Carl. Hi.
Hi, Don.
The reporting classifications object, can you clarify what that is and what it's used for?
Sure. So if we go back to my general ledger for a second. What reporting classifications is going to let Dan do is say everywhere where he sees 100-10 rent, I want to display it to my executives as rental revenue. When it comes, and I don't have it on the screen, but when it comes to showing to my investors, I just want to show that as income. So it's a way that Dan, as a business user with point and click in a Salesforce object, can completely change how the report displays inside of analytics.
So it's almost like a translation, thinking along the lines of the translation engine.
Yeah.
It's almost a way of being able to have alternate views in English of what this particular type of transaction is for.
Yeah, it's exactly like a mapping table.
And that rolls up to how it's actually going to be reported in whatever analytics image we're going to show or report.
Exactly.
And how is the data gathered? That has to be built up, I imagine, from the different accounts in the accounting system?
Yes, and I will show you how I pull that out and how I get that into Salesforce.
And I'll hold on any further question.
Other questions? Good.
I have a quick one. I'm a moderator, but I think I'm allowed to ask a question. Why SQL Server on AWS? Why not Heroku Postgres or something else? Or will you get to that?
Thank you for that question. That's a good question. So I have my AWS with SQL Server running. We know it all as a database. Why did I use it? I had my first call with the customer, with Dan, and with their vendor Yardi, and they say, "Oh, you need some data for reporting. Great. We will give you a SQL Server backup." Really? Can I have an API? No, we have a backup. Can I get a file? No, we have a backup. Oh, and by the way, it's encrypted, it's compressed, and it's on an SFTP site. So sometimes you don't get a lot of choice from an architectural perspective. If I'm getting a SQL Server backup, I need a SQL Server somewhere. So from that perspective, I started looking around and said, look, I'm not going to tell my customer, let's create a server on-premise this day and age. AWS makes sense. But if you start thinking, well, why did I go EC2 versus RDS, so their database services? I'll show you what comes with SQL Server. It's an integration tool known as SQL Server Integration Services. So from previous life, I knew that I could leverage SSIS to do a lot of reuse instead of building from scratch. where the RDS version doesn't offer SSIS. It's just a database. And the same thing if you look at SQL Azure. It doesn't offer the integration tools. It just gives you a database. And there would have been some challenges in getting that database restored on a regular process anyways.
Carl, so the backup that they give you is not a one-time backup. It's nightly or in real time, or how does that?
Sure. So from a backup perspective, it is something that they provide once a night. They will take a cut of the live system, back it up, compress it, put it on the FTP site, and now I have to download it. So that kind of leads into, well, what's my next set of challenges? I need to figure out how to get this. I need to decompress it, depact it. I need to restore it. And then I need to automate this process, right? Because we don't want somebody running this manually, or we really haven't helped Dan out.
And you do that batch every night?
Every night.
Just one more follow-up on SSIS. Did you consider using the reporting services of SQL as well to make this available? That's integrated with SSIS? I'm just curious.
From a reporting services, no, I didn't look specifically at that piece. We did consider some of the other platforms out there, and they really fell into two categories. There were solutions inside of the industry. Yardi itself has an analytics tool. Some other people have an analytics tool. And while these had a real estate focus to them, they were very constrained. You could use and look at what Yardi said you could use and look at. Whereas if you compare it to a Tableau, a Power BI, those are empty platforms. So while you can build whatever you want, it doesn't help Dan in the starting point. Dan wants to have real estate analytics, and he wants to have it his way. And that's where Einstein Analytics fit that bill of, we have something that we can get you started very quickly, an analytics template, but you can always jump out and do your own analysis from there, the ad hoc nature. So it's a perfect blend between the two tools.
So you settled on you had the SQL database, obviously, that was a given, and you were going to use that to do the analysis, and you build a cube, you do all the heavy lifting of the aggregations in there?
No, we'll take a look at how I manipulate some of the relational data and get it built into analytics. It's not using the analytics inside of SQL Server, so it's not building cubes. It's just doing data integration and uploading from there. It's a data store and then my integration engine.
And then really quick, from a business perspective, obviously there are downsides to sharing Excel files, but how do they know now is the time to upgrade to a more modern stack?
One of the reasons that they looked at making the change is in the property business, you're always buying and selling properties. And while you can have manual processes if you have 10 buildings, if you want to scale and you want to start buying properties, your processes have to scale with you. So that was really the impetus for looking to make a change, is to say, this works now, but if we are going to grow the way we want to, we're not going to scale.
Any burning questions in the audience before Carl moves on?
Good. All right, so let's take a look at the first set of challenges, which is how we get this back up. Now, when I have a kind of a complex problem that has a lot of steps, I usually break it into chunks and start doing things manually. I might have an eye towards how I want to automate, but I don't jump in and build an automated process. From an SFTP standpoint, I'm using WinSCP. It's something I've used before to just log into the FTP site manually and take a look at what's going on. From here, I will grab one of the database backups. I'll download it, but I do take a note. I'm like, I'm seeing the pattern that they're using to name these files, which means I probably have something that I can use to automate later. I can hold on to just the part that's a constant. Don't worry about the date that changes. So once I download that file, now it's time to figure out how to extract this thing. And I do some research, which just means I Google extractor and figure out that, great, they're using a common third-party tool. It's called Lightspeed. It's made by Quest. Dell had it. They're back on their own. But the nice thing is they provide this extractor program that I can just call some commands on and be able to get my database decompressed and unencrypted. And the best part is it's command line, so it's something that I could call later from an automated fashion. And if we just jump over, I have the actual command. So I just went through, parameterized some of the information, passed in what the variable is, because we know that the file name can change each night, and then be able to go ahead and decrypt it. So kind of 2 steps down, acquired it, decrypted it. Now let's get back to SQL Server. And again, I'm not trying to solve all my problems right from the first time I think through it. I will just come into SQL Server. I'll manually say restore database, point to where my file is. And then go through the next steps, pick which database I want to restore it to. But the nice thing is, inside SQL Server, you can actually dump these into scripts. So if we look, everything that's going on inside of there, it can be dumped right out into a script file so that I can take it and I don't need to be manual intervention. So even as I'm building, I'm planting those seeds later for when I come back and need to build that process from an automated perspective. So last but not least, once it's back here, this is my source database over here. It's called reveal source. I've just shrunk it down for our purposes today to some core tables. Account is my GL accounts. I have my financials data. I have information about a property, reporting classifications total. So just some basic things that we're going to look at and pull data out. Now this automation. When I built this out, I didn't go the automation route right away. It was more, well, let's get the data up, let's get it in, let's get the customer looking at something, and while they're busy providing us feedback, now I can jump back and work on the automated part of my process. So it wasn't necessarily a linear process where I did all these things and it's great and it runs. It's solve each challenge as it comes, get something a customer can look at, and then use that downtime in order to build the automated process. And that is all done in SQL Server Integration Services. So that's what I have up, SQL Server Integration Services, SSIS. And what it lets you do is it gives you a series of common components that you can do things with. You can copy data, you can execute processes, you can write scripts. If you get really crazy, you can even write your own SSIS components and plug them in as well too. So the first thing I looked at was, oh good, I have an FTP task, let me drag that in, let me start configuring it. And guess what? It doesn't support SFTP. So that's where my WinSCP use made sense. I could come back in, I could say, all right, I'm going to just script WinSCP. So I'll go through a little bit of the code, but really what I'm doing is setting up all my connections, all the information, which file I want to get, downloading it to a directory. And this is, let me hide some of this. So this is the core of what's going on, where I establish my connection based off of these package variables. And that's what I really wanted to show you and talk about is the package variables. What I have outside of the script is the ability to parameterize all of my packages. I just have some example values in here. These won't actually get you in anywhere, so don't try them for the FTP site. But what this does is it lets you easily change how your package works without rewriting your whole package. Oh, you changed the FTP site. Never happens, right? Well, I just have to go in here and change this. Oh, the password got cycled because it's now been 90 days. I can go right in here and change it, and then these all get interjected into that process flow. The other thing I'm doing, before I jumped right into the FTP site, I'm running a database command that's record start. This is just a habit I've gotten into of recording metadata about what my run's doing. When did I start? How many rows are affecting? Because you inevitably have to come back and start debugging your process. There's an error, what's going on? And if you didn't do it up front, it's really hard to figure out what's going wrong. So find last file. Just in case I have multiple backup files, I always find the latest. I go and run the Lightspeed extractor. So this is a step that I mentioned before where we can call any executable that's on our machine. So we can call an executable, we can pass in parameters, we can even build expressions that dynamically find, for example, the file that you want to pass in and decompress. So lots of flexibility for those pieces. The restore backup piece that I showed you before, what I actually did here is I'm calling a stored procedure. I took that command and I put it into a store procedure where, again, I have parameters. Because guess what? Sometimes they've changed their backup structure and they went from 2 files to 3 log files or 3 backup files. So this just goes through, sets the database, and then based off of what's passed in my case, I'm using the 3 different backup files and moving around. So trying to move it out that if I need to make changes, it's in a place that's easy to change. Not that SSIS package development is difficult, but once you deploy it, if you can avoid having to go back into an editor and edit, and you can inject things in, it makes it a lot easier to maintain. And it makes it a lot easier when you have to load a dev sandbox, a UAT sandbox, a SIT sandbox, and then production. So you can make these things work in different environments too, without writing a copy of the process. Yes?
A couple of questions, if I can stop you.
Absolutely.
So
because the last thing is we're done. We're done with getting the source. So perfect time for questions.
Great, thank you. So fascinating. So all of this is running inside of SQL Server Integration Services.
Yes.
I'm seeing multiple languages being used. I'm seeing some C#. I'm seeing some T-SQL.
Yep.
I'm seeing some scripting. Look, was it PowerShell type scripting, or is
No, it's all the scripting was C#.
C#? Okay. Did you build it?
I did build it.
You built it all?
I did.
You maintain it?
Yes, I do maintain it.
Okay. What if you get hit by a bus tomorrow?
From a getting hit by a bus tomorrow, what you're not seeing here is there is a set of installation and setup guides that go with this whole process for the customer that talks through all the steps to install, what you need to configure, which settings need to be set in SQL Server. So it's not the traditional, say, technical developer type documentation, but it's enough that you would be able to go through, and if you had to start, let's just say this whole thing went down tomorrow, no backups, you could recreate all of this in a matter of hours based off of the details to go through and set it up.
Yeah. How long did it take to, if we could divide the effort, how long did it take to conceive of the process? And I know we haven't even gotten to the analytics stuff yet, so I don't want to totally deflect us, but I'm curious about this development. To conceive of the process versus what did it take to build it and get it functioning? Just a ballpark.
It's a tough question for me to answer because I think it's not a linear process of conception and then realization. It's, well, I know how to get this, I can restore it, I don't know how to automate it yet. So it kind of ebbs and flows where my philosophy is when I'm working with a customer, they want this to work, but they don't care about this. They don't see it, it's behind the scenes. They want to see their dashboards. So my focus was more time of data acquisition to them having a dashboard to see. And that was a few weeks at most. But then it was probably a 3.5 month project that went through and got all the pieces working and running. So the first conception was very quick to get piece of data out, let's look at financials, oh, you see your dashboard. But then the automation didn't come towards the end, till the end of the project.
So once you realized what it was you had to build, then you would go back and you would refine the extraction process.
Refine pieces that you maybe weren't sure of the first time you're building. You know, you're not gonna know everything when you jump into a challenge like this. There's gonna be pieces you need to research or pieces you need to ask folks for.
So it was iterative design.
Absolutely.
And it emerged.
Yep.
Cool.
Good.
First, Carl, I prefer to think that you don't get hit by a bus.
Thank you.
Rather that Carl wins the lottery and he's left this to somebody else. But aside from that, on a nightly basis, something will go wrong. The FTP site won't have the file that you need. The conversion goes wrong. Mm-hmm. How are you communicating during this process? How are you communicating that back to the client so he knows there was an error? And above and beyond that, what are you doing for yourself? Do you get a message? Does he get a message?
I'm going to table that, not because I don't want to answer your question, but because I have an answer and it's coming. Okay. So I'm just going to put it up on the board so that we make sure we come back to it, but I will answer it because it's a very valid question, and I've done some things to help make that easier. Good. All right, so our second challenge now is getting those GL accounts into my reporting classification object in Salesforce. So when I started thinking about this problem, what are the ways we can get stuff into Salesforce? Well, the first thing that comes to mind is, well, I could just import it with the data wizard, right? I can get in a CSV file, do my mappings, upload the data. And while that's helpful, it doesn't really help Dan. So I might have done this kind of the first time to get going quickly, but this can't be the final solution. So at this point, I'm really starting to think about APIs. How can we get data in through the APIs? And naturally, your attention starts turning to middleware, because middleware is perfect for taking something from a SQL Server database and putting it inside Salesforce. But that's going to introduce additional cost into my solution. So let's put that on the side. Let's see if we can figure out a way to do this without middleware. What else could I do? Well, I could write something custom, right? We're developers, we like to build things. But for me, again, longer project, more to maintain. To your question about what something goes wrong, if it's custom, I got to build a logging engine. I got to do a lot of extra stuff if I'm building something custom. So let's turn to something that people know. Let's look at data loader. Right, data loader, we can go through, we can upsert. So I can grab my reporting classifications. I can take a CSV file of that data. I can match on an external ID and then go through and create a mapping. Right? All the things that we know you can do. But right now, I still don't have an automated process. What you may not know is you can call data loader from the command line. So I can take what I just did and turn it into a command line solution, which I can then automate. So let's take a look at what's necessary to do that. The first thing I need is I need to tell data loader what to do. And I do this with this process.configuration file. It's just an XML file that has details about different processes I want to run. My process here is reporting classification upsert. So I'm going to update existing records. I'm going to add new records. I tell it what object I want to use. In this case, it's my reporting classification object. You may notice the namespace and underscores in front of it. It even supports managed packages. So it's not just standard objects, custom objects, managed packages, everything. Next, I have a mapping file. So what columns in my CSV file go to which columns inside of the object, the file itself, and the fact that we're reading from a CSV. What you don't notice here is I haven't told it where to connect to. You can put those settings in here, but I like to pull them out into a config.properties file, because what this file will do is it'll let you centralize where you have connection management. So instead of needing to change when you have to go to that sandbox instead of production, you can just come in, and if I scroll down, I have my set of production credentials, as well as I can put it in a sandbox. Now, what I'll tell you is that's not the password. Go ahead, you can try it. It's actually an encrypted version of the password. When you use data loader from the command line, there's a couple of steps you have to do. First, you need to create an encryption key file. And that's really just calling this batch file. So there's an encrypt.bat file in the data loader install directory. You pass it a -G and give it some seed text. It's whatever you want to be your secret that you use for your encryption key. And then you take and then you encrypt your password. If you're using a security token, you include that and paste it into your file. So if somebody opens your file, you're not going to get your password. They just have an encrypted version of it. So that's two of the pieces. The last piece is really looking at this mapping file. And the mapping file is pretty simple. It's field name in the file, field name in the object. I name my field names the same so that auto mapping happens like that. If you didn't, yeah, you can do the drag and drop. I would actually tell you that if you're going to do this, if you come back to this screen inside of data loader, you can actually save a mapping, and that file will work right from the command line perspective. So we have all the components necessary to build this from an automated process. We'll jump back to SSIS. And I have an even simpler package. The first step, what it's going to do, it's going to copy my reporting classifications and put them in a file. So if I click on this, I'll zoom in for you a little bit. I just have a SQL query. It could be a stored procedure. It could be whatever you need, but I'm just giving an example, simple example of selecting all these fields from reporting classifications, and then I pipe them right into a text file, and you define that text file down at the bottom, and you can give it a location that you want it to appear. You can tell it whether there's quoted identifiers, how you want to delimit your file. So if you're doing something like pipes or vertical bars or semicolons, you have flexibility there. And then just simply map the columns. And again, another reason I use names the same way, it auto maps for me instead of me dragging a bunch of lines, which gets very tedious. All right, so what we can do is we can run this, and as it's running, any questions?
Just really quick, for that text file, are there size limits on what that could be, or is that not really an issue?
I'm sure there's a limit somewhere. I haven't run into a practical limit with it. So that actually executed. If you saw the screen going behind the scenes, it was just a command window that had the execution of data loader right from it. So I have a green check here. If I scroll down, I have another green check. So good. We can actually jump back into Salesforce. I can cancel my wizard. And I can see all of those reporting classifications that I pulled out. So you're seeing things like rent with the codes, summaries. So this is the place where now Dan could come in and go through and edit. So if he wanted to, and he said, well, I don't want to call this rent. I want to call this the extracurricular rent. Oops. He could make this change. He has places where he can designate, hey, this GL, we use this to calculate debt income, or we use this to calculate rent. So different ways that we'll see later on, it feeds into our dashboard. So that's challenge 2, getting data into Salesforce, into a custom object, no third-party middleware involved. Questions? No.
So far, what's the cost of those tools?
I will come back and answer cost in a minute. I want to get through because I have a good thing that I'm doing that you'll probably be amazed by the cost. Let's just put it that way. All right, challenge 3. We need to get data into Einstein Analytics. And there's 2 parts to that. There's preparing the data, and then there's uploading the data. From a data preparation perspective, Einstein Analytics is a little bit different. The source system coming from Yardi is relational. So they normalize, they put things in different tables, so there's not repeated values. Well, what do you think Analytics wants? The exact opposite. A denormalized, give me a flat file, repeat all the values, just make it really simple. So I need to go through a process of getting my source data into a format that I can upload into Einstein. I've built a store procedure that goes through and does just that. And what we don't need to necessarily focus in on is the specifics of getting the data out of Yardi, but what I want to talk to you about is the process that I go through. I have my source over here. I have a final destination. What I create in the middle is a staging table. And that staging table, what I do is I clean it out every night, and I take everything from my source and put it in my staging table. Then what I do is I compare my staging to my final. Where there's a new record, I insert it into my final. Where there's a changed record, I update it into my final. And along the way, I will record things like a created date and a modified date. Now, I mentioned I was dealing with tens of millions of records. When I initially went into this, I was a little bit concerned about uploading millions and millions and millions of rows of data every night. So I thought I better build some incremental logic in where rather than uploading 10 million transactions, I can upload the 100,000 that changed. And that's what this approach does, because it gives me a final table that says, I have created these records today, I've modified these records today, those are the only ones you need to consider for upsert. So the process is create the stage table like you want, update the records based off of a key where things have changed. And you're looking at all these statements. Well, guess what? I'm a lazy programmer, so I didn't write this by hand. I wrote code that wrote that code for me. So I just popped in the object that I wanted, and it spit out the different comparisons. Don, was there a question as I'm going through?
So basically, you created your own upsert method.
I did the change data capture that you might have in a source system to know which records you want to upsert, and then I'll upsert them later.
Then you upsert.
Yep.
Very good.
Yeah, so that's really what it was geared towards. Now, as it turns out, kind of a bummer, analytics is fine with tens of millions of rows, so it just got easier to upload a whole final file at the end. But the logic is in there to do it.
If you had to do it again, is that In fact, what you would do is
I would do it the same way because
you do it this
I would do it this same way because
down to 100,000.
because Einstein Analytics supports up to 100 million rows.
Right.
So if we get to a point where if I only need to change 10 million of them and not go back 6 years of history of financials,
Okay.
yes, you're going to have an hour runtime instead of 50 minutes or 40 minutes. So there's a point where when your volume does get big enough,
Yeah.
you're going to want the incremental. But for 10 millions, I haven't had any problems with needing incremental.
Okay, so to be clear, you'd still do the incremental method even on your data set, or did I hear that wrong?
No, I would still build that logic. This particular data set, I'm not doing it because I found out I really didn't need it. But
Got
the
it.
hooks are there because the little secret is, while I did this for Dan, I also end up doing this for other customers. And they have different scenarios and they have more data or they have different systems. So the approach is valid to use from client to client to client.
Yeah, sure. Thanks.
Yep. All right, so I'm inserting my new records where there isn't a match. And you may notice, again, I'm recording metadata. How many records did I touch? How many did I insert? How many did I change? So let's jump back to SSIS. And we'll take a look at the third package I built. And this is a little bit more involved, but it's generally doing the same things. What I want to focus in on first is get parameters. Because what this does is I told you I could operate in an incremental mode or a full mode. Well, I set that in a table. So I set a value in a table that says, run this process incrementally, this is the last date you ran for, so that it can automatically upload. If I need to change to full, I just change it to say, well, I want a full run for this. The idea being, and I didn't implement this for this particular client, but I can put this in Salesforce as a different custom object, let them control the whole metadata process, the whole integration process by pulling down the data first to SQL Server, and then reading off of it and pushing it back up. I didn't implement it, but that's the hooks for the next customer where they want to be able to do stuff. So they're not even touching this AWS server at all. All right, so after that, recording the metadata, copying the file like we saw before. And now, before I tell you how I upload it, I just have a file. So I have a file with all my data. How do we get it into Einstein Analytics? Well, there's a couple of ways, just like before. You can create a data set from a CSV file. So you could do it manually and specify through a wizard the file, the data, everything that you want to load into what's known as a data set. Again, same type of issues that we had before. What the Einstein Analytics app has is a separate API, and it's known as the Insights External Data API. It's really similar to the bulk API that you specify some header information, and then you chunk the details into separate files. In this case, it's I believe it's 10 meg files. So this is another place, hey, I could use middleware. But if I stop and think about it, I have SQL Server, I have Salesforce. Most of the middleware treats analytics as a separate connection, and I have an FTP site. So I'm up to 4 connectors already. So for the ones that are licensing by connector, I've either moved out of even the base package into a mid-level package, or it's a base package plus additional connectors. So really not cost effective for what we're trying to do. So back to, I could build something, but let's look for what's out there. The nice thing is, there is a application, open source from Salesforce, that's called Dataset Utils. And what Dataset Utils does is it gives you a wizard. I've already logged in, but you can specify, all right, I want to create a new data set. I want to put it in this app. I'm going to overwrite. We talked about the incremental. You can append, you can upsert, you can delete. So you have different operations. You specify the CSV file that you want to use, and then you need a metadata file. Well, what's the metadata file? Metadata file is nothing more than a JSON file that specifies each field in my CSV file and says, look, this is a text, that's the identity, this is text. If I jump down to the bottom, here's some dates, and I should have some numerics somewhere, so some numerics. So pretty simple. Just like with Data Loader, you can build this in the UI, save it. You don't have to create by hand. We're doing some cool stuff, but we're not crazy. We don't want to be hand creating any of this. And once I save that, I can upload it through the UI, but I'm going to jump and use the command line version of it again. So that's what this step does, load financials, is it just calls the process of dataset utils, passes in the information. And what you may notice is it's grayed out. What happens is if you don't have any data to run, so when I'm in an incremental process, it would fail. So rather than get a false failure, what I can do is record the run count to say, when I'm running, did I actually export any rows? If the answer is no, I just disable the step, it gets skipped and move forward. I'm going to run this. I'm going to talk about this copy process step as this runs, because it just takes a moment. There was a question before around, well, what if something goes wrong? What do you do? How do you provide some support to it? Well, that's what copy process does. I've kept saying, hey, I recorded this metadata, I kept this information. I actually take and copy all that data up into analytics. Because what I can do in analytics is I can create a dashboard that says, I expect there to be 7 processes that touched at least 1 million rows in the last 24 hours. If there hasn't, I set a notification that emails somebody. It can email a customer. It can even do email to case and come right into Salesforce. And you have those built-in alerting mechanisms to only alert somebody when something goes wrong. Because we all know the email that comes every day that says, hey, this works, is not effective because you just delete, you put a filter on, and then you miss the failures. Right. So in this case, you only get notified when something goes wrong.
OK, thank you.
All right, let's jump back to Einstein Analytics. This is the data manager. Data manager just shows you what's been running. Sorry, I'll go back to the data manager. And you can see my financials uploaded, the process uploaded. So what we can do is we can look at my financials. And inside analytics, we get a very exciting, here's the set of records, but I can switch over and just show you all the values that were uploaded. So at this point, we haven't gone all the way, but we have our data inside of Salesforce custom objects. We have our data inside of Einstein Analytics. Good time for questions before we go into the element of cost.
Yeah, quick question. So dataset utils, is it fair to say, and tell me if I'm getting this right, these are command line tools that do the same work that the point-and-click dataset creation tool that Analytics has?
Yes. So if you're using the UI, it's really just calling the APIs. So dataset util is calling the exact same APIs that the user interface does, whether you run it from the interactive mode or you run it from the command line perspective.
Cool. Data Loader is a desktop app. It looked like dataset utils is something you're running locally on a web server. Can you talk more about that?
Sure. Both of those are installed on my AWS server. So it was going through the data loader installation process. Dataset utils was just a download. And then I have the jar files, so the Java files that I can use to launch from the Java runtime.
So it's a little more work to run dataset utils than data loader. You have to provision it on a web server somewhere.
Well, I don't need a separate web server. It's the fact that I have it on my AWS because I went EC2. If I had gone RDS or Azure, I also wouldn't have had the web server to run those things. So to your point, yes, I would have had to get another web server to connect to the database. But I didn't have to build anything. It launches itself it's all embedded in Java in the program in the jar. So there wasn't anything to install with dataset utils other than downloading the repository from GitHub. Make sense? Am I clear? Okay. All right, so you've seen me do a lot of executing processes kind of not manually, but I'm still clicking buttons, right? This isn't yet an automated process, so we got to take it to the next step. That's where we're going to take these packages that I've built, and we're going to deploy them to our SQL Server instance. So inside a SQL Server, you can hold deployed versions of your packages. So that's what I have listed out here. It's just the same package, but rather than using it in the editor, it's installed inside of the SQL Server. The nice thing here is I now have the concept of environments. So I'm loading to this Wave beta environment. And what I can show you is from an environment perspective, I can create all these different variables. And with one click to say, use this Wave beta environment It knows it's this SQL Server instance, it's this Salesforce instance, these are the locations. So I can create one for UAT, I can create one for dev, I can create one for all the environments I need. Don't need to redeploy processes, don't need to rebuild everything. So that's the first step, is how we can have those processes there. The next step is getting these things to run on a schedule. Well, guess what? There's SQL Server Agent, which is a job scheduler. So as you can imagine, you have the ability to define schedules. You can go in and say, every day at 7 a.m., I want to run this process. You could go through, you could even send a separate email if you wanted to when the job failed. So you could have a notification scheme. If you really need to have uptime, you could even page somebody, send it to that way. The next thing you do is you just define the steps that you want. So these are the things that we looked at: getting the source database, exporting the financials, upserting the Salesforce, loading analytics. And if we look at one of these steps, what you may see is the package that we use, and then the configuration. So I picked Wave Beta. I could pick a different environment and have a whole different set of variables. Now, what you may also have noticed is the last step, shut down server. So what am I doing there? Well, I'm running a command that turns off my server. So when my processing is done for the day, I shut it off. Which kind of begs the question, well, when you want to run tomorrow, how do you get back on? Well, that's where AWS actually helps me. And what happens is I use a data pipeline. So what a data pipeline does is it'll spawn a small EC2 instance that just runs the command to start my EC2 instance and then shuts itself down. So I'll spend maybe an hour or two processing. So what's the current spot price? I think it's like 80 cents an hour for SQL Server. So for $1 or $2 a day, I get all this data, I integrate it, I push it up into Salesforce. It's all there to use in the custom object in Einstein Analytics. So compare that to the cost of a base level middleware, and I'm way, way ahead. All right, let's kind of put this all together inside of Salesforce, because we haven't seen any cool dashboards yet. What I'm going to make use of is what's known as an analytics template app. An analytics template app lets you package in common functionality. So you could build dashboards, you could build data sets, and ask a user a series of questions about how they want their data to display. So this isn't a process that he has to do every time. It's the kind of a setup process the first time you want to install and have your dashboards ready. But it will ask you, well, all right, I just want to show the financials dashboard. I don't have any custom information. I want to show these particular fields on my dashboard filter. And then at the end, what are some of the other properties? I'm not going to run it because it takes 2 or 3 minutes. But what happens is after it completes, you can come in and you can look at a financials dashboard. So this financial dashboard has been built to give Dan all the things he needs to know about his business. So it has key performance indicators. It has details on each property. He can take one of his properties like Autumn Ridge and click on it, and what will happen is everything about that dashboard will change, so it just shows the income related to that property. And then last but not least, when he gets those ad hoc questions, he can use this as a starting point, so he can actually explore and now interact with his data to ask that question that an executive had for him that wasn't in the dashboard. So what I'll do, I'm sure there's some questions. I'll run my data flow, because we changed one of those reporting classifications. We can take a look at what that will look like while I answer some questions.
Carl, a couple of questions. I think you said you have about 10 million records right now running in, and no issues at 10 million records.
Yes, for this example, I didn't put the full 10 million only to save. We're talking 20, 30 minutes of runtime,
Okay.
which.
But your client is running 10 million without.
Yeah, they have 10 million.
Trouble. So backing up, a couple additional questions. One is, I understand the AWS service that you were running. Kind of a one-off question is, would you be able to do this type of processing, not exactly with these tools, using their Lambda services in some way? So you avoid having to start a server and stopping it.
The short answer is I have no idea.
Okay.
I'm not an AWS expert.
Okay.
So this is one of the things where when you're architecting, you end up kind of working on the edges. There's things you know really well, and there's some things that, you know what, I can get this done, but it may not be the best way. So that's where I would turn to somebody, maybe you, that knows AWS better to present some alternatives that I could look at and possibly improve the solution.
Fair enough. The other question I've got for you is first a statement. Most of us have a love-hate relationship with data loader. Many days it's more hate than love. And I was wondering if, especially in batch mode, if you would use maybe the CLI functions. The new Force.com CLI has upsert capability built into it. Very command line heavy, obviously, but it might suit this application well. Had you thought about doing that? What were some of the things that I might run into if I wanted to do something
Sure.
like that?
So if I look from a history of when I built this solution and how it's evolved, those weren't necessarily options because this was started a few years ago. So it was kind of when things were in beta or pilot, and for production type uses, I need a very, very compelling use case for me to consider putting a beta solution in. So that's one of the reasons I hadn't looked at it. So it would be worth me taking some time and investigating that more. Absolutely.
You're going to talk about cost?
Sure. So from a cost perspective, we have a Salesforce platform license because I'm using a custom object. I'm not using any of the Sales Cloud or Service Cloud functionality. We have a Einstein platform license, so that's per user. List price can be $150. You can work with your AE on what that would actually be. And then last but not least, the $2 a day of AWS EC2 usage.
And of course, the X factor, which is your time to conceive of it, design it, and then implement it. And you seem to be hinting that there were some surprises there, that it wasn't as difficult. It was an iterative process, clearly, but actually from start to finish. And I'm not asking you to tell me what you got paid for it.
Sure.
But I'm sort of sensing a suggestion that it wasn't that an enormous a deal because you were familiar with the platform. You had SQL Server skills. You could leverage even though they handed you the SQL Server backup, you were already familiar with SQL Server and the integration services. So
if we look at it, it was, I mentioned about 3 months in duration, but it wasn't a 100% time project. It was a 25, 30% project. So we're looking at 100, 200 hours. I mean, we're not looking at a giant $1 million work order to put this together for a customer at all.
No, that's nothing.
Yeah, it was.
So I imagine the client satisfaction rating?
So this client, so Dan is interesting. Dan was maybe a little reluctant when we first started to use analytics. It was new, it was different. He liked Excel, he was used to Excel. He got to the point where he was actually running investor meetings from analytics, where he would live present the results of what's going on. And if I fast forward, Dan actually, within the past month, joined our company to help sell this to other financial services real estate companies. So he definitely turned into a believer and liked what we were doing.
Was he using Salesforce before this project?
They had Salesforce, but he was not really using it. It wasn't in the asset management group. It was more in the leasing and operations area.
Was he using Salesforce Mobile before this project?
No, he wasn't using.
Was he using Salesforce Mobile after this project to look at the analytics?
Not Salesforce Mobile, but the Einstein Analytics app. So yes, that version of it he was using.
So he gave it a 5+?
Yes. Yeah, he was very, very enthusiastic after it.
Cool.
So given all the automation that's possible with AWS, when do you still use middleware?
I'm sorry, what was that?
When do you still use middleware?
So when do I still use middleware? So this was a very specific solution. It's taking things from one place to another. There is not an overall enterprise architecture where we have an ERP and we have external ordering systems and we need to orchestrate processes. And there's a lot of those use cases where middleware is perfect because it is a larger enterprise. It needs to move things from one place to another. And middleware is the answer for it. But because of this was so point-to-point specific, started with a weird requirement of here's a SQL Server backup and you need a SQL Server, let's leverage that instead of laying middleware on top of it. If Yardi gave API access, middleware might make sense. It really might, because I'd have to look at the cost and what made sense, because now I could just go directly from Yardi into analytics and Salesforce.
We have a question from the audience here. He wanted me to ask on his behalf. He was concerned about data storage costs within Salesforce.
Okay.
He has a specific instance where he has, it sounds like, more data than what you're dealing with. And it sounds like the AWS costs are low, but maybe the Salesforce costs could be high.
So from a Salesforce perspective, if you look in the custom objects, that's going against your data storage, and if you had any attachments, your file storage. So from that perspective, most customers have a few hundred, maybe a few thousand GL accounts. So we're not looking at much data. It's only 2K per record of data. So I don't have any concerns about the Salesforce storage limits. The Einstein analytics, it's completely separate. The data doesn't count against your Salesforce storage limits. It's done solely on a record count basis. So it's 100 million rows if your platform, 25 million if you use one of the apps. So as long as you stay under that number of rows of registered data sets, meaning you can work in a data flow and make changes, as long as you only end up with 25 million or 100 million, you have no concerns there. If you need to go over, you can buy add-ons from Salesforce, so they can add more rows to you. Does that help? No? Why not?
I'm not understanding if you're storing data in regular data storage or in big objects or in files, because 100 million records will cost you more than $100,000.
No, the 100 million records is going to Einstein Analytics. Okay. It's a completely separate set of limits than anything on the Salesforce data storage side. So the 100 million rows, or the 10 million rows that I load, it goes into Einstein Analytics. That is not the same data storage limit that's inside of a Salesforce custom objects. So that's where it's separate and you don't have to worry about. Because yeah, you're right. If I tried to put it into custom objects, all the transactions data, I wouldn't have a solution because you'd be paying for storage.
Hi. I guess so. I have two questions. One is, of course, in architecture, you're always.
I'm sorry, I can't quite hear you.
My question is with architecture, you're always thinking about supportability, right, for future state, and because you're obviously a consultant, you're in, you're out, you're done, and then someone has to maintain it later. So I guess I have a couple of my questions. One is the use of full backups. So if they're using full backups, when did they change to going to incrementals? Because of course, using full backups is not typical in operation. It was an operational pattern. So what would you do if they had changed that? To all of a sudden now you're getting a full weekly and then incrementals daily.
So if that were to change, it would come from Yardi. So it'd be something outside of my control that I would have to adapt to. So the process would be Yardi would provide you the seed full backup, and then instead of doing the restorations the way I've done, I'd be doing incremental restorations inside of SQL Server. So I'd just adjust the process that instead of where I'm doing the store procedure with full, it would have two modes, one to do the full, and then one to do the incremental coming on a regular basis.
Okay, thanks. And then my other question is this is heavy written in C#, so. Which is all executing in SQL. So you're basically using that as your logic layer, right, to do all your work. For future supportability, or why didn't you look at something like MuleSoft or or Jitterbit or whatever to do your transformation? Because you're basically bringing everything back to denormalized anyway.
So I could. Much of what you do from a transformation perspective with the MuleSoft or Jitterbit, you can do that with SSIS. So I showed a very simple, I'm copying this step, or I'm copying this row in my data to this row in the file. You can get pretty advanced with doing sampling, doing functions, doing concatenation, all the things that you've seen in those tools. I could do it inside of SSIS if I needed to, but I've tried to keep that simple and put more of the logic inside of the Transact SQL store procedures, only because to me it's a little bit more maintainable. Once I've integrated in, or once I've deployed the SSIS package, I don't have to change it. I can just change the stored procedure underneath, and then I have different results coming out. If I kind of fast forward some of my thinking of where I may want to go in the future, I could actually take all the logic that's in my stored procedures, and I could actually extract it out of SQL Server, and I could put it up in Salesforce. I could make it configurable inside of Salesforce, and on a per client basis, we can adjust the ETL logic in Salesforce, download it to the SQL Server, execute it, and then send the data back up. So I could make it something that is fully maintainable in Salesforce, point and click, business user, well, business plus maybe a little bit of technical users, but nobody has to touch the server, it just runs. So that's kind of the longer term vision of where I could even go with this.
So they're basically like back to the lottery bus. If you got hit by the lottery bus, then they're out looking for someone who has your type of skills versus having low code, no code type point and click citizen developer type work.
Well, that's one of the reasons, and I know we're at a Salesforce conference, but SQL Server and SSIS, it's not it's not obscure. You know, it's something that a lot of people have, and in many ways, you may find it easier to find somebody to develop that than to hire an Apex developer. So that part of it, I don't feel like it's specific. Yes, I kind of put all these different pieces together, but the technologies themselves, they're very modular, because what I've done is I've actually taken this same solution to another customer, and guess what? They have a AS400 as their general ledger with a SQL data store on-premise that they use to pull out their data. So I have to change, I don't use my source acquisition, I use the same logic to prepare data. Well, guess what? They also use Delboomi as their standard ETL engine. So I swap out all my ETL and use their Delboomi instance to upload in analytics. But because I built it modular, it's easy to drop out one piece and put it in another when I go from one customer to the next.
Thank you.
Yep, you're welcome.
Just a quick follow-up, because he was talking about the different technologies and the difficulty, and your comment that finding a SQL Server technologist would probably be they'd probably be cheaper too than an
Yes.
Apex developer, and certainly ubiquitous. So it might leave people thinking that one of the harder aspects of this to master is the analytics piece. So for the benefit of the folks in the audience, can you describe how you learned Einstein Analytics, previously known as Wave,
As
and
Wave.
make suggestions as to how they can possibly chase that and show them how approachable it is?
So if I go back, I started, what was it, like 4 Dreamforces ago when Wave was first announced. I had prior experience business intelligence and data warehousing, so it was very interesting to me. I'm like, this looks very fast, which is one of the knocks on traditional BI and data warehousing, is it takes a long time to see anything. So I went through some of the trainings. They were offering brown belt trainings, which was a more advanced training, went through and went up to Toronto, went through some of the courses, and then got some projects and actually got to work with customers on building solutions and figuring out how this works and some of the tricks of the platform, and spent some time on the community, engaging in the success community, seeing what people had questions for, gave me some good ideas that I could use myself, went through the trailheads, and I've kind of, I can plug it, right? I've kind of gone over to the side of trying to help people learn analytics. That with you, Don, we put together a play-by-play that walks you through everything about Einstein Analytics and how you get started, what's a data set, what's a dashboard, how can you put it together to answer a particular solution. So that's available on Pluralsight as well too.
So for those who don't know what Pluralsight is, they've got a booth over on the other side, and you can get a free pass, and you can watch Carl's course for nothing. Absolutely free.
All right. If no one wants to come and line up, I'll line up here.
Uh-oh.
Don't be afraid of standing in front of the mic, everybody. I have a question. I have 2 questions, actually. I'll ask them both. One is, you mentioned you sort of blow away the data in Wave and reload it every time. I understand sort of this append-only nature. You insert rows, upsert, update, or maybe not update, but so how about delete? Are you ever loading, like, reversing lines with like negative numbers to sort of make them net out to 0, or is there delete functionality? And then my other question is a little unrelated. Have you heard of dbAmp? I don't know if the folks know what dbAmp is, but it's a way to let you query Salesforce data from SQL Server. Did you consider using dbAmp for this, and why or why not? I guess obviously you didn't use it, so why didn't you use it for this?
Let me answer the second one first. So yes, I'm familiar with dbAmp. It's great for pulling down data, pushing up data, using it in SQL Server integration services. Cost. Not that it's a very expensive program to install, but again, I could do it this way without needing to pay anything additional for a third party. So it's kind of the buy versus build when you look at it. It was more economical on this project to use what we had, what I built in the time of the project. If it were going to be a much higher hurdle and a lot more work, then yes, purchasing something like that makes a lot of sense. So going back to the first question, deletes. So I didn't mention deletes. It's also another reason that I went to full instead of incremental is because my understanding first working with the customer is, no, we never delete anything from our accounting system. We just reverse it. Yeah, they delete stuff from the accounting system. So yes, deletes started being a problem where, oh, this property, we have this weird transaction. Oh, you deleted it. All right, so I would have to build a separate flow because where I can insert I can insert a record or I can update a record together. What I can't do is I can't delete it. I need to create a whole other file of my deletes and then pass those up separately. So it was more efficient at that point to say, look, a full doesn't take long to run. Let's run it all in, and then we know we're always up to date and we don't have to mess around with deletes. But if I got a very large data set, that's exactly what I would do. Where I had my procedure, I would add a delete row, put out a delete file, and then pass that into analytics as well too. Good questions.
Question about complexity of support of the solution. So tomorrow your client will change data taxonomy. How much time it will take to adjust all the processes?
So if the source system were to change, the way I've built my process, I go from source to stage to final to upload. I really only need to change that first step of how do I interpret the source and put it into my stage table. So while it seems like there's a lot of downstream effects, it's really isolated to the first part. So if they change one of their fields or they need to do something different, I just need to change that first part. Because the rest of it will flow through. From an analytics perspective, you have text fields, you have number fields, you have date fields. It's not more complicated than that. You're not getting into, oh, well, this is a text 50 versus 255. It's a text field, and usually you'll go 255, and it's not a problem.
Hi, Carl. Good afternoon.
Hello.
Thank you for sharing your knowledge.
My pleasure.
I have a question that is related and somewhat separate regarding your design and how would you have done things differently if your client needed to share all of this data with either an external party and or an external part of the company. Let's say, for example, they had a managed services division that handled all of their accounting and real estate operations, but it was handled as a separate entity within their organization rather than all internal.
So I might actually not do much differently, and there's a reason for that. And what we've been working with this client to do is I mentioned those investors, and those investors are interested in how things perform. Right now, they are external entities. And we're talking about, let's build a community for these users because you can expose analytics inside of a community. There's a license to let them have access to a dashboard to see just what they need to see. So that's the first step, is a community with Einstein Analytics. The last piece of your question, I think, is a little more nuanced, which is, hey, Dan's seeing everything, but if an investor is only in 2 buildings, how do you limit that data just to what that investor could see? There's a concept inside of analytics known as data set predicates, where you can define rules to say, oh, this data set has something that says investor ABC, only show it when the investor matches ABC. The other flip side is if you don't want to use predicates, you can actually use sharing inside of Salesforce. So if it is a partner or customer community plus, where you have sharing rules, you could share the records and make the data reflect the underlying records like a property. So that's how I would extend it outside the organization to have access to the same type of analytics.
Thank you.
Yep.
Hi. So my questions are around loading issues. Since you loaded 10 million rows and let's say 1,000 of those rows didn't load for whatever reason, you have, how did you handle that?
How did I handle 10,000?
Well, how did you handle that some of the rows didn't get loaded? Did you reprocess it? Did you have to reprocess the whole file? Or?
So how did I know which ones were changing? So that was my export procedure, my export financials, where once I had my new set of data and my old last run set of data, I just joined them on the same key and said, did any of these values change? Like, it was a very brute force where statement that says, if the name changed, mark it as an update. If the date changed, mark it as an update. And that's how I did the comparison to say, these were your rows that changed. So I didn't have, some source systems will give you change data capture. Well, it'll do that for you, where it'll spit out, these are all the records that changed, like Salesforce does. You can go through the APIs and say, give me everything that changed since this date. I tried to mimic that myself with the SQL statements in my stored procedure.
Yeah, actually, what I was wondering was loading into analytics.
Oh, loading into analytics. Okay, so instead of doing the override, if you maybe saw it inside a dataset utils, I had an operation to upsert. So if I call the upsert operation, it will add new ones and modify the existing records. The only trick to that is you do need to have one of the fields in your file as the primary key. So if you look back to my JSON file, I had the first thing, my financial identity, that's set as the unique ID true. So once you set that, you just have to say, here's the same ID, it's an upsert operation, and it'll figure out which records it needs to change for you.
Okay. And did you run into any security problems or concerns that you have to deal with?
From a security perspective, using the AWS instance, I made sure my security groups were locked down, so I have a very restricted set of IPs. I had to put in my own IP to remote desktop here because I'm usually not doing it from a conference. So those type of things were in place. I didn't show inside a SQL Server, but my packages are encrypted with the files where they have database connections. From a parameters perspective, there's what's known as sensitive. So if it's a password, you do it as sensitive, it treats it as encrypted, it won't show you it. So there's those elements built in that we didn't necessarily touch in, but yes, security is always part of what you need to keep in mind when you're architecting.
Thank you.
My pleasure.
I'll ask a question if anyone else wants to line up. So this is a nice set of financial dashboards. Were there any requirements for more of like a financial statement where you're looking at something that looks more like a traditional report? Because I think those things are sort of difficult to do in Wave.
I'm so close. I'm so close to doing one. So I do have, what I can do with a pivot table now is I can get a category like income, the subcategories. I actually did a video recently of how you can put totals in a pivot table. So the only thing I can't do currently is I can't format that total row where it's bold and double underscore like you'd see in a financial statement. But Safe Harbor, I've heard it's coming, maybe the next release where you can do editing in tables dynamically. So if we can do that, then yes, I'm hoping I can get back to that. Here's 12 months of income, looks like a financial statement, because you're absolutely right. Analytics is great at the interactive and showing dashboards. Getting a kind of static report that looks like a financial statement, not its strong suit yet, but I think we're getting really close.
So just further on that, so is that a widget or a component of analytics? Or are you talking about shaping the data that came out of what you created for analytics and exporting it into Excel and running a pivot?
No Excel. No Excel.
Yeah, I didn't think so, but can you clarify that?
Yeah, absolutely. So if we were to look at my dashboard, if I go down to the bottom of my dashboard, I have this piece of information that's almost like a light financial statement. This is what's using a data table. So if I jump out, let me find my financials data set. So if I do financials, I change to a pivot table. We'll look at the sum of the actual amount. We'll group by category. We'll group by code name for the GL. We'll group by summary. Drag that to the top. We'll put in the period year. And then what we can do is we can actually change our table style, make it look pretty. Now, what you could imagine here, I don't have my statements with the numbers in front of them, so they're not sorting in order right now. But this is the start of a financial statement, right? Summaries, categories, code names, periods, years. What it doesn't have is the grand totals. But what we could do is we could jump over to the SQL side of things, and we could take this statement, and we could just make a modification to it. So if we go in, instead of summarizing by the code name, we'll make a subtotal stream. And where we had the code name, we'll now just put in the text of total. Oh. And I broke something along the way.
So while he's fixing that or looking at that, we're down to about our last 5 minutes.
All right, I'll answer that question. I have a whole video on doing it instead of doing it live, so we can walk through that.
Hi there. Just a quick question. What you have in analytics, when you uploaded the data, there was a separate data set than the one you use in Salesforce.
Yes. So we can look at the data flow quickly. What the data flow does is it actually will pull in data from different places. So my data flow that I'm opening up, what it does is it will pull the reporting classifications from Salesforce. So it says that custom object that we uploaded that Dan changed, pull that into analytics, pull the financials down here that I uploaded from my SQL Server, and then put them together. I'm doing some things that don't necessarily matter until I get over to this augment, where the augment, oops, that's the property one. But the augment will basically say join it together on the GL code, and then at the end we register a new data set that is my final financials. So it has all the data that Dan created inside of Salesforce along with the raw data coming from, and that's what my dashboard is built off of. So if we were to go back and look for financials, that's the final data set that's prepared and that the app uses. This is the one that I just uploaded, and you can see it's in the data uploads folder for that reason. So good question.
Thank you.
Do we have any one more last quick question here? No? I can run a mic over to you if you don't want to stand up. All right. Well, thank you very much, Carl. This was an awesome session.